Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is William Sims. I am a second-year master's student here at University of Georgia, and today we're going to be talking about the strategies for mitigating thermal stress, that being in any sense of production, which we'll go over some of the research done behind those mitigations using shades today. So talking about the three management strategies for attenuating thermal stress, we have about physical modification of the environment, that being anything between shades, sprinklers, fans, but today we are going to be mainly looking at shade. We also have genetic development of lower maintenance breeds, that being certain research mainly we're used to those zebu breeds such as the American Brahmin, but we also see research being done on some Bos Taurus breeds such as the Thule or the Romaniana. And also, there is also people using improved nutritional management, that being when to feed, what to feed, and so on and so forth. But again, for today, I'm going to focus in on that physical modification of the environment, which is specifically I'm looking at shade. So research done behind this, back in 1959, it's about 4 or 5 decades ago, we have been using THI, or temperature humidity index, compared with the new method we've actually developed in around 2006 by Gaughan and a team of researchers in Australia called the heat load index. The differences are listed below. I went ahead and highlighted the major points. So in the equation for THI, they look at ambient temperature and that relative humidity. But in HLI, we do look at black load temperature, relative humidity, and wind speed. Black load temperature is actually dry bulb temperature, and also including that solar radiation, so actually what the cattle is feeling. And I feel like it's a better representation of how the cattle are reacting to that stress, rather than THI has been mainly used from the beginning in humans and have been kind of integrated into the research of cattle. So HLI is specifically used for cattle in itself. And that also we have these devices that we also use to measure HLI, THI, black load, accumulated heat load units. We'll go over all that soon. But these are the devices. I'll put a link below and where to find them, maybe the cheapest prices for them if you want to try to integrate them. And I'm also probably going to make a video on how to use them as well. So basically, let's say we were to buy these little systems on how would we actually integrate this, or what does it mean, HLI in general, is that HLI does take into effect, again, black load temperature, relative humidity, and wind speed, but also takes into effect genotypic, phenotypic, and management practices. That being genetics such as their Bos Taurus, Bos Indicus, so on and so forth, the phenotypic being their coat, management being what you're giving to them, that being shade, water, so on and so forth. So here we have genetics being, let's say, that threshold originally that was created was around 86, this being for Bos Taurus, no shade, healthy cattle who are black-hided. And we can see here, if we look over the animal factors, management factors, we see 0 on all of those. So the basis is that 86. Anything above that for these cattle will start accumulating heat. So if they have an HLI of 88, they will start accumulating heat over time. So cattle who are maybe Bos Indicus or white-coated might have an HLI threshold of 93 instead. That being that we know by research over these years that Bos Indicus, excuse me, Bos Indicus are naturally, usually genetically less prone to be heat sensitive, or less prone to heat. So we see that all these different factors, but today we're going to be honing in on shade. Shade being that you can see as the amount of shade that's available to the animal, we see this increase in threshold, meaning that if you have a production system that gives them about 3 meters squared, which is fairly 3 to 5 meters squared is a pretty good amount of shade. We can see anywhere up to +7, that being back up to that 93 threshold for cattle who are even black coat, for your Angus steers that are black coat, Bos Taurus, and also are healthy, you'll have that threshold of 93. So you have more room to not accumulate that heat and affect your production. So that can be integrated into any system. So what are shades? What do you need? What are some of the research behind them? Is that the factors I'm going to be talking about today is that it's influenced by the size of the shadow casted, location, orientation, and type of shade material. So first off, what are the type of shade material? We have cloth and we have iron sheets. Both have their advantages and disadvantages, such as cloth has a disadvantage of being less durable than iron sheets. We have less protection from that solar radiation because the threads can only be threaded so tightly to a point where there will still be some exposure to sun through those shade structures. I believe the threading, we can get about an 85% reduction in that exposure to that solar radiation or that sunlight. Advantages are that it has better natural air passage, again, being that threading is not completely shut in like an iron sheet is a complete structure, and that air can actually flow through those cloth, creating a more natural airflow into these systems. And also it is very cheap compared to getting iron sheets. Also, so this is, again, we're talking about the threading. If you're ever going to get some cloth, ordering, you can see different types of cloth materials. As you can see, 30%, they're very, the holes can become very wide and spread out. Up to 80%, we see them very tight. And this kind of gives us an idea if you have shades out in your pasture, if you have shades in your feedlot, whether or not how much solar radiation, how that is affecting your system. So right here, some research has been done to show that heat load index actually increases as shading is more open. So open cattle, right here you see that HLI is hitting up to that 90, which is well above that threshold. Most likely these cattle are probably accumulating heat. But as you see, we go down, we have 60% shade, and we have 60%, also with 60% shade, and also with an iron reflective surface, we see that it's starting to slowly reduce that HLI. So also slowly reducing that ability to accumulate heat by these cattle. Also over here, again, we talked about the black lobe temperature, that exposure to sun. You see how it progressively gets smaller and smaller, and we get to that 100% shade, it's at its lowest. So it's just kind of talking about how the more we prevent solar radiation, the less HLI, less black lobe, and therefore the less HLI, because it is a huge factor in that equation to calculate HLI. So size of the shadow casted. We want to make sure it's a sufficient size to cover all animals. Again, we did talk about that 3 meters squared up to 5 meters squared, so that size is very achievable as long as you have the correct size of your shade structure. And size is also affected by the angle, not by the height. This is the pitch. So a lot of the times the pitch or the angle of the shade will be around 18 degrees, anywhere from 10 to 18 degrees. And if you increase the height of that shade structure, that will not increase that cover, but that will increase the ventilation, the amount of air that can move through your structure, and also it increases the amount of the speed at which the shadow is casted. So a lot of times people say that if you have a higher structure, the radiation into the ground, to heat up the ground, will actually increase, because if you're moving that shade faster, it's having less time to actually acclimate and become colder. So height has its advantages. It does have its disadvantages. And also cattle are more prone to go into areas where shade structures are taller, which was, there was a study done that if they were given a 6 foot versus a 12 foot, at all times, they were exclusively going to the 12-foot structure. So location does matter. Typically toward the center of the pasture, this can affect accessibility and the movement of shade if these are not in the middle of the pasture. For example, I went ahead and made this fun little animation, and that, let's say you have a structure that's not in the middle, let's say it's more to the right. So at 9 a.m. the sun's more to the left. We say towards noon it's quite above, and to the right at the PM. As you can see that the fencing lines, those are the two lines that are away from the shade structure, that portion of the shade is not accessible to the cattle. So they're more prone to having more exposure to that solar radiation when they can't reach that shading at some points. So orientation does matter when picking your shade structures. North-south usually moves with the sun during the day. It creates an area where you can actually dry the surface of the pin. Also, increased exposure does have a risk of higher surface temperatures, because as that sun moves, that the shade will also cast with that north to south structure. So as that shadow casts away from the shaded structure, sunlight can penetrate the inside and also warm up the inside footing. And also east to west doesn't really have that problem, but it does require opening. So east to west doesn't move with the sun. So if you don't give it time, or if you don't give it any exposure to sun, there can be accumulation of feces, ammonia, and it can actually get pretty nasty under there. So a lot of times they'll put slits so it can actually move with the sun and also expose some sun to dry that surface. So looking at the research behind some of the stuff some people have done with shading, this is one of the things I wanted to personally put in, because this is a really good thing. I'd pause, save this picture. It does show you, it's really old, but it does show you that threshold where cattle are going to start, it's going to start affecting their performance. They can see right there for different production cycles, white being their optimal temperature, black being their nominal performance losses. But this is based on ambient temperature. So this can actually be misleading, because black lobe temperature, the exposure to solar radiation can exacerbate the amount they're going to go into that nominal performance losses. So they could be at 15 and that's fine, but the black lobe temperature can probably nudge it faster into that nominal performance losses, which actually probably pushes more for the want for shade to reduce that exposure to black lobe temperature or solar radiation. So looking at some effects that it has on a dairy sense, there was a study done by Ponce in 1976 showing that shade structures actually reduce the amount of mastitis quite significantly. He also saw the difference that it caused in the increased amount of solids and not fat percent. Also in the table 3, to the right, you can also see that shade increased the overall percent yield of milk daily. But that does kind of combat with the research done by Collier. Both this research was actually done in Florida as well, because we have a lot of problem with heat in the Southeast. So a lot of these projects you will see in the Southeast, where he didn't see any differences in milk yield, but he did see differences in calf birth weight. So you can see problems maybe with your cow-calf performance. You can see problems possibly with your milk yield. Also differences in your milk quality. I showed in all that in both of these slides. So shades do play a pretty significant role in your performance of any type of cattle. Also in the top left, you can see that over time with shade, your average milk production also decreases over the weeks compared to the no shade. Also looking at feedlot performance, we see that there is a tendency to have lower amounts of average daily gain. You do see a significant lower amount of final weight and higher amounts of feed efficiency. Not numerically significant, but not significant, just numerically in their feed efficiency, but you do see that it's affecting their final weights, which can affect the feedlot. Also looking at carcass, because again, I am actually part of the meat science. You can see in the bottom left, I wanted to look at least a portion of the meat science, that we do see reductions in quality grade, as in there was a higher amount of choice and lower amounts of select in those that were shaded versus those that were unshaded. So in conclusion, shade structures can be utilized to improve performance and even carcass quality. We're looked at all forms of production, that being in cow-calf, your dairy productions, usually go hand in hand. Feedlot, so if you want to implement shades in your pasture, your feedlot, it will improve the performance, but also there is an up cost, and whether or not you could put in that fixed cost or not. We want shades to maximize ventilation after an afternoon shade. So we want to make sure their height is tall enough so we can increase the amount of thermal buoyancy, that being that heat will rise as cold air can get sucked in and allow that to naturally cool the animals. A slope of 18 degrees is a typical starting point. So if you're curious at where to start in that pitch, 18 degrees is a good start. The area, again, we look at is 3.5 meters squared to 6 meters squared per animal unit. Again, we looked at the HLI threshold, so you can go down that 3 meters squared, but it's good to play safe and get up there in a higher amount of area per animal unit to increase that HLI threshold and ultimately decrease your accumulated heat load units, which can decrease your performance. Normal height is somewhere around 3 to 4 meters. Again, if you increase the height, that's great. It will cost more money to increase that height, but again, you get better ventilation, better airflow, more thermal buoyancy. Also, they're less frightened by higher structures. But again, also it's good to get advice from an engineer's advice on how to build your shade structures. And again, that is all I have. I will put the references below and some links, so please look below in this video, and thank you for listening.